Well, we've just had an amazing talk by Diana Aitenshenko, CEO of Leonardo, and we're going to be spoiled one more time today by Sherri Wasserman with her titled presentation, Collaborative Multidisciplinary Imaginations. We heard Diana talk about reimagining for quite some time during her talk, and today we're also going to hear from Sherri Wasserman. My amazing introduction to Sherri was in a colloquium where she was talking of all things about the company IKEA and creativity and 3D architectures and printing. Sherri is an amazing person who brings a stealth and wealth of a variety of artworks and transmedia, I would say. She calls it experimental research, perhaps in design, but I want to give her the opportunity to describe herself, her installations, her work, the amazing CV of residences in art that she has had in so many different places, but also the exhibitions, her work in curation, so much more. Welcome, Sherri Wasserman.
Hello and good day. I'd first like to thank Katina for asking me to contribute to the discussions amongst the incredible group of people who've been a part of the PIT Colloquium. I'm honored to present after Diana, and thank you all for attending. Within today's brief talk, I'll bring together two of my situated positions. First, as a designer of public experiences for more than 2 decades, through a wide range of scales and mediums on an even wider range of topics. And second, as now an STS researcher who's currently PhD candidate in ASU's Human and Social Dimensions Science and Technology program. I entered the PhD program with the specific aim of sorting out how to apply my professional background through tactics beyond my extensive experience to help us figure out better ways forward together in what then, a few years ago, already felt like a world on fire. The PIT initiatives and Colloquium, I think, have similar aims to my own. Today, I'm going to address my talk abstract as a set of questions. I won't have all the answers, but turning this into an inquiry rather than a manifesto positions the groundwork I'll lay here for discussion and further consideration. To begin, how do collaborative multidisciplinary imaginations address social, ecological, technical uncertainty and create interfaces between people, information, and systems in ways which impact our future paths? And as a result, how may collaborative engagement and design practices make more something public interest technologies? First, I want to note my removal of the word efficient, which is what I used in the talk description, as an adjective from the second question. Efficient is one concern, as is effective, but so is inclusive. All those adjectives as principles are entangled in substantial ways beyond the time we have today. So let's for the moment acknowledge that a range of adjectives should be there. And second, let's clearly define words that can be used by different sectors in different ways. Let's consider this a framework for some specific examples, which will hopefully plant some seeds for possibility. What are collaborative imaginations? Imagination can be a very gauzy term that infers creativity and cognitive manifestations, and this is relevant to our interests. But let's also employ STS perspectives to this in acknowledging broad social imaginations and imaginaries. I frame my own understandings of collectively constructed imaginations and imaginaries, particularly those that address our conceptions of technologies in 3 primary ways that build upon one another. First, Taylor explains that broad social imaginaries are constructed through the great connected chain of mutations of the public sphere, a market economy, and the citizen state. All 3 intersect and evolve to create social conditions through which citizens imagine and invest in collective civic goals, projects, and commitments. Second, Marcus more specifically addresses techno-scientific imaginaries as conceptions that arise from interactions between individual scientific systems, public perceptions of the utility and risks, scientific and technological developments, governmental structures, and narratives about science, scientists, and the state. Third, in the case of PIT concerns, it's also worthwhile to consider the additional specificity socio-technical imaginations as defined by Jasanoff and Kim. They refer to these imaginaries as conceptions of scientific technological breakthroughs within society that are almost always imbued with implicit understandings of what is good or desirable in the social world writ large. Socio-technical imaginaries are collectively imagined forms of social life and social order reflected in the design and fulfillment of nation-specific scientific and/or technological projects. Joseph and Canmore also argues that socio-technical imaginaries are articulate, feasible futures. Now, I've mentioned not just socio-technical uncertainty, but social ecological technical uncertainty, because the projects I'll reference here and my current research intersect all three. What's the difference between these two types of systems? At its simplest, socio-technical systems describes the ways in which society informs our development of technologies and how our adoption of technology simultaneously molds society. Social ecological technical systems are often more specifically situated in the ways in which we are entangled not only between technology and society, but also the environments and ecologies within which we live, work, impact, and are impacted by in return. Now, why do we care about impacting future paths? Let's think of this first as less about whether or not interacting with a better form improves one access to healthcare, for instance, which may have very tangible results for individual futures. And instead, let's frame these questions in how impacting future paths may expand our imaginations in all previously defined ways, of what's not just probable, but possible futures. According to cognitive psychologists, humans each developed and maintained internal databases, mental maps of our past, present, and potential futures. When individuals revise and add to the data records, they expand both their comprehensions and their expectations. Individual and collective expectations always include evaluative data and values. However, future studies scholars explain, if individuals, organizations, and communities consider the future to be something that can be transformed, they engage with and embed additional values into those expectations. The future is not fixed, even overly predetermined, or something to simply be filled. The future may be seen as open, and individuals, organizations, and communities have agency to impact what the future may become. From the definitions I've just run through, you may have begun to get a sense of why the concept of multidisciplinary collaboration matters. Public interest technologies, again, conceptually, including but beyond the build of better form notion, involve themselves in knotty problems and require multiple perspectives towards working together on solutions may provide the most beneficial impacts to both systems and users. To explain multidisciplinary imaginations, I'm not going to define the concept for you. Instead, let's do two things. One, let's look at two projects that I've been involved with as part of my design career and within my current research. And two, let's discuss these projects not just as experiences, but actually as intersections between people, systems, and information. For the purposes of this talk, let's consider these intersections as different forms of conceptual and design interfaces. And this is where we're going to focus through the rest of the talk. In other talks within the Colloquium, and if you, like I, have been trying to get your head around what we mean when we use the term public interest technologies, you've heard about human-centric design practices. I'm all for the intentions of human-centric design approaches, but I also find in practice the application to sometimes be overly binary. I'm thankful for those in the design community who continually work to evolve our forms of collaboration and engagement. I'm personally heavily influenced by Christoph Bedichko's interrogative design approaches and a big fan of the framing of design justice practices as articulated by Sasha Costanza-Chock, but as a noted representative of a much larger community. I'm also personally a continual work in progress in the ways in which I aim to integrate respectful ethnographic exchange methods into how I approach each project and research site. For the purpose of this talk, let's think about design processes as interfaces in themselves. If human-centric design is an interface that's a back and forth, a call and response, can we more expansively imagine other forms of exchange? We're going to view these examples from the positions of what they created, how they address the posed questions, and what we might learn from their strengths in supporting multidisciplinary imagination towards collaborative design. So Rivers of Ice was an exhibition of photographs by cinematographer and mountain climber David Brashears that paired 19th and early 20th century photographs taken by explorers of the Himalayan mountains with second documentation of the same locations photographed by David over a period of years beginning in the early aughts. The exhibition included a combination of paired photographs, historic artifacts, a minimal number of quotes from writers who'd impacted David's work and worldview, and a multi-layered map system that grounded visitors to the exhibition held at the MIT Museum in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the locations throughout the Himalayas. The design of the exhibit was fundamentally staged for multidisciplinary collaboration, in part because MIT, as an educational institution, wanted to both appear as apolitical as possible in talking about the impacts of climate change, and wanted the exhibit to be used as a tool for discussion rather than as a documentation of certain rhetoric. In this case, what that meant from a design approach is that there was little to no didactic information. The opening of the exhibit in 2012 remains one of my favorite examples of potential use of exhibits for multifaceted discussions. As visitors arrived, they were each given a randomized number, each number aligned to one of a handful of experts from whom visitors would receive tours. The experts ranged from a geologist, to a hydrology engineer, to a science journalist, to the director of the museum. The tours were given simultaneously, so as I wandered through the opening, I was hearing intersections and overlaps, completely different stories, and those that seemed to enhance one another, as they all used the exact same images, maps, artifacts, and quotes as jumping off points for discussion. At the end of the simultaneous tours, the museum brought together all of the experts for a panel discussion that was watched by all the visitors at the opening. Though much less in depth and rich than the tours, the panel participants spent time discussing key points of potential contention and possible collaboration on perspectives for thinking about impacts of climate change and how we might conceive of ways forward. If we think of this exhibit as an interface, the artifacts of the physical space told fundamental stories of global issues witnessed by individuals who had their literal boots on the ground in this specific location, and how the visible fundamental change in those landscapes were evocative of our changing world. That essentialism, in this case, worked as a bedrock for opportunity for both deeply targeted and the evocation of fundamentally multifaceted collaborative imaginations. Rather than a back and forth paradigm to integrate viewpoints, we might say that it allowed for peaks and valleys of layering of perspectives, metaphorically the base of for something of maybe a more mountainous form of engagement. Given the complexity of concerns for things such as the impacts of climate change, design engagements that allow for variation and iteration of discussion may serve as more effective design tools for conversations that need to engender flexibility for wide variation in perspectives and the possible evolution of information exchange over time. This type of literal interface may be a difficult proposition if we're talking about fixing a government system full of forms, but I think it's useful in two ways. First, we can imagine our design research, even our overall build plans, in ways which flexibly allow for multifaceted input, in ways that strengthen the overall process without overburdening it. And second, if we think of public interest technologies more broadly, so things that catalyze our imaginations about our engagements with government in the future, maybe we can also think about what sorts of artifacts become the bedrock for multifaceted discussions, and how we may design interfaces between our essential information systems and people that allow those exchanges to be generative and evolve over time so that we may continue to expand our notions of what a collective future path forward may be. The COVID tracking project, which I'm going to refer to as CTP, was a geographically distributed networked effort to gather and analyze pandemic data in the face of socio-technical failure. 4 co-founders, 2 journalists, a data scientist, and a content strategist began CTP in March 2020 to acquire pandemic-related information that was not offered or easily accessed through US state and federal agencies. Initially meant as a stopgap measure until governmental data became more accessible, reliable, and comprehensible, the project evolved and expanded into a massive, mostly volunteer-powered civic technoscience initiative, persisted for the entire first year of the pandemic. Variably skilled team members taught themselves, each other, media outlets, government agencies, and wider publics how to comprehend evolving COVID-19 knowledge, parse multiple types of data, and utilize technological tools that they built and iterated upon to support their daily collection efforts. From my minimal description, you begin to get a sense of what this was, both as a multidisciplinary collaborative imaginary and about what our relationships to government and society may be, and as a fundamentally multidisciplinary collaboration between not just variably skilled team members, but also an incredible range of expertise. The leadership team itself included public health experts, data scientists, polished storytellers, mostly in the form of journalists and technologists. But the specific academic and career backgrounds of both the leadership and wider initiative varied widely. And this is where a less tangible but absolutely essential aspect of what made this project work came in. From my months of observations of Slack channel communications and virtual meetings, I witnessed a form of engagement that I rarely, if ever, witnessed to the extent that it was forefronted at CTP. The importance of ethics and care between people inside and outside of the organization, as well as for the data and communications, was absolutely essential for the team. And I would argue that it was absolutely essential for their ability to accomplish everything they did. Did they need to create a nuanced emoji library of thousands of images, one so complex and embedded in the culture that even after months, I still emoji communicate at the level of a toddler? Or celebrate each other's pets' birthdays with multi-page PDFs of birthday wishes from their own pets? Or create slide deck presentations of appreciation for one another? Or the stories I could tell go on in the most incredible ways. It's possible that logistically the project may have been built without these remarkable, soft, playful, sympathetic skills, but I'm not convinced. If we think of CTP's relationship between people, information, and systems as a particular kind of interface, how they perform their ethics of care were fundamental connectors. Given the local and national situations of the team members who worked entirely online and represented most of the 50 states, navigating uncertainty was core to their project in multiple ways. They simultaneously attempted to parse the situation of COVID data, federal and state, while trying to make sense of what COVID-19 is as both scientific, public information changed, while iterating, developing their own responsive technological forms, while navigating their own individual challenges about exposure, new work and family concerns, and configurations in their own environments. They woke up each day in a strikingly evolving world, choosing the task of collecting and making sense of both the data and our situations. And here's where I want to note a way in which CTP handled uncertainty differently than nearly any other trusted data source. Despite many brilliant members and a stellar level of work product, the organization's culture was one of humility. They deliberately noted aberrations in the data, questions, concerns, and reasons they found for variations. They were absolutely transparent in ways which more traditionally institutionalized sources weren't, even if they knew they and others were using the exact same sources to create their reports and analyses. Uncertainty wasn't just something they navigated as both people and an organization, it was also a key point to their communications, and their communication of such was in part why they became such a trusted source. Their daily data collection and analysis across all states and US territories was done by people, though they improved their data management over time in a really incredible, immense spreadsheet they called Worksheet 2 as a reference to the Google Sheet tab within which they collaboratively worked. Individuals first multiple times a day and then later once a day manually collected data from state websites, asked questions, sent emails, and made phone calls to find missing pieces and clarify confusion. Within the data collection and quality assurance process, they also established ways to have multiple team members check the data before it went live. They worked closely with public health and science communication experts within the team to evolve their visualizations to become as clear and as useful as possible, to the point where you could regularly see CTP-made charts on major news programs on a daily basis. CTP as a people information systems interface was incredibly layered, entangled, and supportive both within the ways in which the organization operated internally and how they intersected with governmental agencies and the general public. Behind the scenes, throughout the project, they spoke with members of governmental agencies, those agencies from whom we'd expect to see the work the CTP did. Their public report cards assessing the quality of state data, which was one aspect of how they communicated what they were finding and how they navigated it, was one lever to push states to improve their collection and reporting practices. Their efforts supported redesign and improvement in government data systems, and they were regularly called upon to present their perspectives and findings to members of government who appeared to be earnestly attempting to assess where the US government had gone wrong in its response. In their last month of operation, they held public workshops about their processes, data sources, and findings, and their extensive documentation may be unprecedented for a project of their sort. This is only a tiny glimpse into what I've learned about CTP thanks to their incredible trust and generosity in allowing me to observe them as part of my dissertation research. I also acknowledge that I don't yet have a succinct diagrammatic version of CTP's structure as interface to describe in the way that I felt that I could for Rivers of Ice. However, I hope that some of these descriptions provide possible visions of subparts and/or complex configurations. And from that notion, I want to return to this question of impact on imagining possibilities for future paths. On their last day of data collection in March 2021, there was a massive outpouring of appreciation sent to them both directly and across social media and more traditional media channels. Two of my personal favorites were by Chris Hayes and Rachel Maddow. On the last day of data collection, Chris Hayes spoke for approximately 2 minutes about the importance of CTP's work to his MSNBC show's reporting. He acknowledged the use of both their charts and analysis for their own ongoing comprehension of the pandemic. He also acknowledged that the project was ending in part because it should not have needed to happen in the first place. CTP arose to compensate for major governmental socio-technical failure. And though we now see multiple ways that addressing crisis could play out, we should expect better. Either that night or the next, the new head of the CDC was interviewed on Rachel Maddow's show. In the midst of conversation about the, let's kindly say, variably strong pandemic response of the CDC, Maddow literally asked Dr. Lewinsky why the CDC couldn't be more like CTP. Multidisciplinary imaginations will assist us in building better forms that provide more effective interfaces between people, information, and systems. They can also, both at small and large scales, impact our navigations of social, ecological, technical uncertainty in ways which help us individually and collectively conceive of possible, not just probable paths forward. What I'm saying here is yes, let's emphasize the absolute necessity of human-centered design and creating technologies that operate as interfaces between people, information, and systems. But let's also keep in mind more expansive configurations than the binary of us STEM collaborative research to consider varying technologies, roles, and possibilities that may offer different solutions to different problems. Just as not all public interest technologies are the same, neither are our best strategies for collaboration. Sometimes more is just more, but sometimes leveraging multidisciplinarity through creative forms allows us to both communicate and imagine more effectively together.
An amazing master talk for those of us who have been deeply studying socio-technical theory and socio-technical design. Your talk was so powerful.
Thank you.
I'll comment, Sherri, it belongs in top-tier peer-reviewed journals in this space. So I encourage you so much to publish this. And it's also very reminiscent of a recent paper I've had to review or oversee, not really review, oversee in a process, which talked about Taleb's uncertainty and looking at how we can harness that for opportunity, like you've so beautifully put together and presented to us through these two examples and your work in general. That's something that should be shown to every socio-technical class.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been trying to figure out ways in which to fuse the kind of real, I don't want to say real world versus academia, but the kind of hands-on, tangible, making and doing aspects of interacting with audiences on complex topics with thinking about these larger theoretical frameworks and how can they learn from one another. And I recently keep coming to this idea of interactions as interfaces, right? Like that it's, and what Diana was saying was so resonant about these intersections, because so much of what I look at with people as part of systems comes down to relationships. Relationships are essential between individuals, between groups, to systems. And so, as extraordinary as the work that something like CTP has done, what's even more extraordinary is getting to witness how they treat one another and how that work is a manifestation of kind of ethics, of care and priorities, and it comes through in the kind of quality of the work as well, in ways that I look back to my collaborations with people like David, and he was all heart about it. He photographed these places because they were places he had personally visited, the mountain climber for 30 years, and he was watching the devastation. And he was very generous about allowing those to really be a jumping off point for so many difficult discussions that weren't prescriptive, but instead allowed us to navigate them together, hopefully in ways that can evolve and strengthen over time.
You resonated so much with care, as you just mentioned, and you also mentioned humility as those two key drivers, and the fact that those that work together would send each other PDFs of thank you notes, and how that empowered one another to feel appreciated and that they were working towards a common goal, this co-design almost, not just participatory and inclusive and consultative, but co-designing together with the various stakeholder types. Sherri Wasserman, we've run out of time, but I just want to say thank you. I think there's going to be a lot of overlap with what you've just said with the speaker in 3 or 4 weeks' time, Jumana Abugazela, who's also on here today. I knew she'd resonate with this human connection and empowerment through design and through configurations that are novel and multi-layered and multidisciplinary. So I look forward to continue that conversation at that time. But thank you deeply for that expert presentation and the depth of preparedness and preparation you went into, which was very obvious. I look forward to sharing that online after I've got your okay, and for that to be embedded in my classes. That's for sure. It's like reading a summation of 100 papers at least. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. And may everyone have a great week. For those who dropped off, I got notes, Sherri, to say, sorry they had to get off, but they are so loved what they got up to the CPD project, the COVID tracking project, CTP, sorry. But thank you so much from the depths of their hearts. Thank you, everyone. Have a blessed week. Bye.